So, I just realized something really dumb. For all this time, I forgot to add a link to the video we were analyzing, so a pretty big oopsie by me. That situation is now rectified. There's a link in the description for those who are interested. Anyways, I also realized that we're not even halfway through the video, and that's not a good pace. So I've decided we'll be speedrunning the rest of it in this one video. There are 3 more scenes to go through. 2 of them are easy to explain, and the other will be a challenge. So this here is one of the easy scenes. The only interesting thing to note is that there is some verb omission going on here. The complete version would sound something like ループでハープを弾くのをやめなさい, where 弾く is the verb to play, as in to play an instrument. A verb omission is pretty common in speech. For example, 家でゲーム or 家でお風呂に is a pretty natural response to a question like, what will you do after this? In these instances, it is pretty clear what the intended verb should be, and so mentioning them is unnecessary. On to the next scene. Right, so obviously this is the challenging scene that I was talking about. Here's the sentence in all its glory. I've separated it into parts which we will look at individually. First, let's get rid of no yamenasai, since that has been explained I don't know how many times already at this point. We're left with 3 parts, and we'll look at them from right to left. So the first part is supu nomu with the o particle omitted, and this obviously means to drink soup. The second part is rupu to rupu no aida. Now, aida, or rather one of its many meanings, is the space between, so that the whole thing translates to the space between the 2 loops. Now, the second part is connected to the first via the particle de, and this designates part 2 as the stage in which part 1 occurs, i.e., the soup drinking is taking place in between the 2 loops, which is indeed the case if you look back at the video. The tricky part is the last one, 双方の力が均衡している. Let's start by going over the vocabulary. 双方, this means both sides, as in both sides of a book, both sides of a road, etc. 力, this means power or strength, and 均衡, which means balance or equilibrium. The general pattern here is noun 1 plus ga plus the ている form of a verb plus noun 2. In our specific case, noun 1 is 双方の力, the power of both sides. The verb is 均衡する, to be in balance/equilibrium, and noun 2 is part 2, ループとループの間, the space between the 2 loops. To explain this pattern properly, I would first have to talk about transitive and intransitive verb pairs, and this is a very big topic, enough to deserve its own video type of big, and since I do not have the luxury of time, I'll have to be very brief here. Japanese verbs usually come in pairs. For example, the verbs 回す and 回る both mean to turn/spin. Now this is not so confusing once you realize that English also has 2 versions of the verb spin. Spin can mean the act of spinning something, like in the sentence, I am spinning the ball. But it can also mean the spin of one's own accord, like in the sentence, I need a better look, could you spin around for me? We say that spin is transitive in the former sentence and intransitive in the latter sentence. Thus, the word spin is ambiguous in the sense that it can refer to both the transitive or intransitive versions of spin, and context is needed to distinguish between the 2. Japanese doesn't have the same problem, since the 2 versions of spin are represented by different words. 回す for the transitive spin and 回る for the intransitive spin. Looking up images of 回る and 回す makes the difference between these 2 verbs clear. The images of 回す showcases acts of making something spin, whereas in 回る, the spinning happens of its own accord. I mention all this because the interpretation of our grammatical pattern changes depending on whether a transitive or intransitive verb is used. Specifically, in the case of a transitive verb, the pattern roughly translates to noun 2 that is being verbed by noun 1. For example, 食べる is transitive, so the sentence 人が食べているりんご translates to an apple that is being eaten by a person. And a Google image search confirms that this is indeed the case. For intransitive verbs, the translation changes to noun 2, in which noun 1 is doing or in a state of verb. For example, 回る is intransitive, so the sentence 頭が回っている人 translates to a person whose head is spinning. And this can be both in a literal sense or in a non-literal sense. And by that I mean a person who is in a state of confusion or in a state of dizziness. And again, a Google image search confirms that this translation is indeed accurate. Applying the same logic to 双方の力が均衡しているループとループの間, we get the translation space between two loops in which the forces on both sides are in a state of balance, which is a pretty shitty direct translation, but 双方の力, I can only imagine, refers to the force exerted by the two loops which are keeping the hammock, which is the space between, from falling down. And of course these forces would have to be in balance for them to do so. Taking all this context into account and adding in part 1, this is the best I could come up with in terms of a translation. To drink soup in a hammock suspended in between two loops by equal balanced forces. Okay, one more scene left, and it's an easy one.
やべ、警察だ。降りて。
だからやめよって言ったじゃん。
いや、いいよ。
え？
ループないもん。それロープだもん。
はーい。
So basically we have two students afraid that the officer will scold them for riding double. But the officer replies with, yeah, いいよ, which is like, nah, you guys are good. And then he explains himself by saying, ループないもん。それロープだもん. Which means, there is no loop. That's a rope. And this is meant to be a pun, since loop and rope make very similar sounds in Japanese. Furthermore, we also see that the mon/damon sentence ender was used, and its purpose here is to emphasize a certain reasoning. In this case, the officer was explaining why it was okay to ride double on a rope, and emphasis was needed since the two students were clearly confused by the mix-up between rupu and ropu. And that's it. That's all the grammar and vocab from a 40-second clip explained. That took like, what, only a year, almost? Now that I have that out of the way, what's next on my list is to edit and upload my vlogs from Japan. So stay tuned for that. That's it. Goodbye.